Up until Moses died, Joshua was playing a supporting role. Moses' life and work takes up 4 very detailed books of the Bible. And he dies overlooking the promised land, and his right-hand man takes over. Enter Joshua, stage right. Joshua was absolutely dedicated to Moses. He was always at the great leader's tent door, ready to respond at a moment's notice. Joshua and Moses are, in some ways, a study of opposites. Moses was old. Joshua was young. Moses was a great orator. Joshua never reached such heights. Moses was a details person, but Joshua went crashing in to leadership. Moses sent others into battle, but Joshua was a true warrior, leading the charge, getting into the blood and sweat of battle. Among the generation of Exodus, only 2 people will enter the promised land, Joshua and his friend Caleb. Moses was a man of light. He actually and literally glowed. But Eli Wiesel notes a kind of darkness around Joshua, a kind of melancholy. He writes, a sadness that stays with him to the end of his days, because his life unfolds in the midst of noise and fury. As we move from the first 5 books of the Bible, the Torah, which is filled with theology and worship ritual and a whole bunch of laws, we encounter now one story after another and a series of character sketches, some very familiar to us. The book of Joshua is a story of entering and conquering the promised land. The people had been promised this land through Abraham and through Sarah. The people were freed from slavery through the working of God and the faith of Moses. And the people had been walking for 40 years toward this promise. It may remind us of the journey to Oz. Follow the yellow brick road. The realization of all desires and dreams are seemingly at their completion. And while the journey is difficult, there are always blessings. The yellow brick road winds its way through the wilderness, and while on the journey, people think about what it will be like when they arrive. Milk and honey. Milk and honey, baby. The times, they're changing. This is going to be the good life. And that good life is just over the Jordan. In the book of Numbers, Moses has sent a reconnaissance team, which included Joshua and Caleb and 10 eminent heads of tribes, to check out this land of Canaan, the promised land. And after 40 days, they had returned. And 10 of them came back with a desperate report. The land was filled with milk and honey, that is prosperous. But the people who lived there, the Canaanites, well, they were stronger than Israel, and they were fighting people. They worshiped other gods. They were powerful. They that were big and fortified, and the people were gigantic. It looked hopeless. Then Joshua and Caleb stood up and gave their report, and it was very optimistic. They believed in God's design that the land would be yours, but they admitted it would come at a price. I would imagine that second generation of Israelites thought they would just go strolling in to the land and it would just be handed over to them. Not to push the metaphor too far, but we know that the story at the end of the yellow brick road is much more complicated. And there's nothing storybook about conquering the promised land. The account of Joshua is one that reveals the difference between this ideal that they carried with them and reality. What they dream and what is true. What they hope will be a celebratory culmination, but in fact is the beginning of a long, hard struggle. The story of conquering the promised land, possessing it and holding it, seems to us like a very brutal story. And so I want to talk for a few minutes about that elephant in the room. Stories in the Bible that make us uncomfortable because we see them as huge acts of violence. They make us uncomfortable because under God's instruction, the war that ensues is pitiless, and we have a hard time matching that up to the God we worship and follow. It's incomprehensible to reconcile images of the ever-loving God who tenderly fed his people in the wilderness, gave them water in the desert, who gave the commandments not once but twice, and who heard the suffering cries of his people, with a God of a scorched earth policy and a take no prisoners approach to conquest. This is one of many stories in the Bible that gives rise to the heresy that we have two gods, one of the Old Testament and one of the New Testament. So let's take a closer look at this source of anxiety that makes a lot of Christians not even want to read the Old Testament because it's so vicious and ugly and there are horrible stories in it. The first thing that stands out is that Joshua wasn't written at the time it happened. It was written many, many hundreds of years later, possibly even in the time of David. At that point, Israel was not a powerful and prosperous nation anymore. The audience of the Joshua story had been victimized, made homeless, and enslaved again by the major empires of their day. The people had been exiled from their land by Babylon and by Assyria. So the audience was different from the folks who were there. Another point that we share with many of our own versions of history is that it is written by the winners. In other words, we won. So God must have blessed everything we did. And not only blessed it, but God actually ordered everything we did. Manifest destiny again. When winners write history, atrocities are usually overlooked or justified by demoralizing those who lost. All the Canaanites were horrible people. There weren't any who were worth keeping alive. They were savages. They were ungodly. And so it was God's will that we wipe them out so that the good guys could possess the land. That sounds very familiar to us. But archaeological evidence shows Joshua contains stories that are not historically accurate by our standards. Archaeological sites have found evidence that Israelites actually lived alongside the Canaanites and took full possession by gradually infiltrating the land and infiltrating the culture. The reports of genocide were greatly exaggerated in the accounts of Joshua. Evidence unearthed at these archaeological digs suggests that when the Israelites had to fight, they fought, but they also lived with and won over the Canaanites, working with them, finding them valuable, and helping those Canaanites who did not like what was going on in their land to help them overthrow their own corrupt landlords. Now, we've been taught throughout this series that the codes of Israel did not support violence. But violence in Hebrew was a very specific term. Violence in that time is spoken most often as human arrogance and self-interest, selfishness, taking what you want because you want it. That's violence. And violence was about defying the sovereignty of God. So we must read these stories in context and with knowledge of who wrote them and when they were written. As we dive into the book of Joshua in the next weeks, it will be important to not only read it in context, but also to let the way the battles are reported not keep us from enjoying and embracing its amazing stories and statements, which really are the main point of the story. The book actually utilizes irony and humor, as we will see next week in the story of Rahab, a prostitute who outsmarted two groups of men to preserve herself and her family, and who becomes an outstanding member of Jesus' own genealogy. A Canaanite is listed in Jesus' genealogy. Joshua is full of intrigue and suspense and things that every modern reader loves in a good story. It lifts up underdogs and shows that the impossible is made possible. It also showcases the person Joshua, who is so faithful and strong, and I guess kind of a hunk, courageous and influential, but who, once all the parades are over, dies lonely and almost forgotten by the people of his own time. At the end of the story, Joshua dies at the age of 110, it says, and is buried on his own tribal land. It is written, Israel served the Lord in the days of Joshua, and all elders who outlived Joshua and had known all the work that the Lord did for Israel. Just like us, so much happened between Joshua's birth and his death. And in the end, just like us, the most wonderful thing to be said of Joshua is that he was a servant of God. The glory of any of our lives is in servanthood to God. We might want to be remembered for all kinds of things, but the most important thing that someone can remember about us is that we were a servant of God.